Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I am back with another project for Not Too Shabby. Today I'm going to be using the Unicorn Dreamland and Unicorn Magic stamp sets, and I'm going to be using just a couple of different images from each one of those sets. I am working on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I am going to start by stamping out my images with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because we're going to be doing some Copic coloring. Now I wanted it to look like this unicorn was kind of sleeping on clouds. So I'm going to stamp the unicorn first because she'll be up front. So anything you want to be in front of another, you'll want to stamp and mask first. And then I'm going to go ahead and stamp the cloud. Now the cloud was a little bit smaller than what I wanted for my little unicorn here. So I'm going to stamp the cloud twice. I'm going to stamp it once, mask that out, and then I'm going to stamp that again. Now I tried to kind of cover up the little star that is part of the cloud, and at this point it looks like I succeeded, but once I removed my mask I realized that a little piece of one of the stars was sticking out, but that's fine. Next, I'm going to go ahead and stamp just that plain or just the cloud by itself and also mask that out. We're going to be doing some ink blending, so you'll want to make sure that your masks are cut as close to that black line or right on top of that black line and line them up the best you can. I never line mine up perfectly, but we'll fix that in the end. Last, I'm going to stamp out both of the little stars and mask those out as well. And now I left a little bit of a gap here, and this will be for my sentiment. So I am taking out my sentiment. We're going to stamp it last or close to last, but I'm just making sure that I have enough room for it at this point before I continue, or to make sure I don't need to continue to stamp any more images. So once all of my images were stamped and masked out, I'm going to take 2 pieces of Post-it note tape and I'm just lining that up on either edge of the card panel. So only the middle portion of the card panel will be showing. I'm going to be working on a scrap piece of paper, and we're going to be using some Distress Oxides. I am using Picked Raspberry, Dusty Concord, Peacock Feathers, and Mermaid Lagoon. And I'm just going to kind of mush these colors together, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to start off with my Picked Raspberry, and I'm just going to plop down some color. I'm not worried about getting a perfect blend at this point. I just want to kind of lay out where my color will be. Next, I'll move on to the Dusty Concord and kind of go around that pink because those 2 colors will blend nicely together. Next, I'll move on to the Mermaid Lagoon and kind of place that around the Dusty Concord. Again, these 2 colors blend together. If you're not sure which colors will blend nicely together, just look at the rainbow. Whatever 2 colors are touching, they're going to blend well. Finishing off with the Peacock Feathers, and this is where I'll kind of go back to make these colors blend. So whatever areas are touching one another, I'm going back in with my ink blending tool. Occasionally I'll put a little bit more ink on there, but sometimes I'm not re-inking it at all. I'm just kind of using the tool and whatever ink is left over to make sure that those colors blend nicely together. Now, once all of my colors were blended and I was happy with the way things were, I'm going to go ahead and take a smaller paintbrush. This is a number 2 round brush, and I am just going to splatter on some clean water and then dab that up with a paper towel. And then I'm going to go in with some shimmer spray, and you want to make sure that this is you really shake this up good because all of the shimmer settles to the bottom. So I shook this up really, really good, and you can kind of see if you look at the bottom if there's anything left over on the bottom. Just going to remove the nozzle there and sprinkle that on, and again dab that up with a paper towel. I did let this air dry for about 10 or 15 minutes before removing my mask because they are paper masks, so they were wet, and you want to make sure that they are completely dry before you remove those, or else you run the risk of tearing your cardstock as you're removing those. You can see I'm using just the tip of my scissors and very, very slowly removing them, and this will kind of avoid ripping that paper. Now you can see some of the areas of my masks started to come up a little bit when I did my ink blending. So on the tip of that little star, or both 2 stars actually, and that little bow, I have some ink that bled through. So I'm just going to take a damp paintbrush, not a soaking wet one because this is not watercolor paper, and I'm just going to paint right over where that ink bled through, and then dab that up with a paper towel. Make sure this is completely dry before you color over it. It won't take too long as you don't add too much water. So moving right into the coloring, I'm going to start off with the clouds. And initially I was just going to use my C markers, which I did use for my shading. My darkest is the C5, and I'm basically where the cloud is kind of puffy or indented in, I'm just creating a little C mark. And then I will go right over those C marks with the C3, a whole lot of C's going on, and create just a few more little puffy areas of the cloud. Then blend those out with the C1, and then finally I'm going over the entire thing with my colorless blender fairly quickly, but I don't really care if my colors mush together all that much because it's a cloud. I'm going to do the same thing with this next cloud that my unicorn is on. The only difference for this one is that I'm creating a shadow underneath the unicorn. So I'm just using my C5 to kind of outline the bottom portion of the unicorn. And each time I'll just blend that out a little bit further. When I get to my colorless blender, I am going to go over all of the cloud area, but I'm going to try to avoid going over the shadow part underneath the unicorn because I don't really want that to blend out all that much. I'm going to keep out my C markers because I want my unicorn to be white as well. So I'm going to use that same color combination, and I'm just adding some shading underneath where her hair is kind of hanging over her face, where her face is hanging over the rest of her body, that one leg that is behind the other, and where her back leg is kind of coming up a little bit. Also on where her tail is kind of hanging over her little bottom there. Blending that out with the C3, and then I'll use some flicking motions with the C1 to kind of fade out to white, still leaving some white space. I wasn't liking how this was blending in with the clouds, so I tried to go over the clouds with the BG70, and it was just still far too light. So I ended up bringing in still a very light BG marker, but it's a little brighter. So I'm going to use the BG 000, and I'm going to go over the entire cloud. Now we already have the shading and the texture that we had created with the C markers, so I don't need to create any more. These will kind of show through, but this will just give it a little bit of color to kind of differentiate between the cloud and the body of the unicorn. So next we're going to move on to the stars, and I'm starting off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas, and I'm basically just picking a side of each portion of the star. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. You'll get dimension no matter what you choose to do. I'm also creating a shadow underneath the little bow, and then going in with my darkest color to go over those same areas that we had mapped out with the lightest color. Blending that out with the Y35, and here I'm using just a little bit of a flicking motion because jumping from the Y35 to the Y11 is a pretty big jump. So I was anticipating having a little bit of trouble blending, but honestly they actually blended very nicely. And then just leaving a very small highlight area for that Y000 right there, pretty much in the center of the star. Now I'm also going to use the same color combination for this star that is on top of the cloud, but I'm not really worried about the shading for the little points of the star. I'm just adding a little bit of shading where the star is kind of tucked underneath that cloud. But again, going in with my lightest color to get that paper saturated, this will make my blending a lot easier once that paper is saturated. Finishing up again with that Y000 just for the very tip of the star. And I'm moving on to the hair and the tail of the unicorn. And I'm just adding, I'm using a 3-color blend for each little section. Also coloring the bows with the YV20s or RV20s, sorry. And using the same color combination as I did for little pieces of her hair and tail. And I'm basically just adding a line of the dark blending it out with the mid-tone, and then finishing off with the lightest color. I'm not really too concerned about shadows. I just want her hair and her tail to have a little bit of dimension. And I'll show you the color combinations that I used here, but I colored pretty much everything the same way. I'm pretty much sticking to colors that closely match the Distress Oxide inks that I used in the background. So I'm going to be using some pinks, some purples, some blues, and of course some blue greens. Peacock Feathers is probably my favorite color, and the BG markers are my favorite colors as well. So I always have to add those in somehow, some way. So I am, again, just going in with just little pieces of her hair, trying not to put two of the same color directly next to one another to kind of break everything up. And then I'll finish off with some B markers for that little blue piece of hair that she has there, which is the only one that I actually have left. So once her hair and her tail was done, I'm just going to take that C1 marker and just go over, well, actually, I forgot her little ear. So I'm going to use my C3 and C1 and just leave the very tip of her ear white to kind of match the rest of her body. Use the C1 to color in that little horn, I guess it was. And then her little hooves I colored in with the C3 and C1, this time not leaving any white. For the remaining stars here, I am going to do a little bit of shading on the larger ones, but this time I'm going to skip the Y000. I felt like these were small enough where I could go in with a 3-color blend, and honestly, you could probably get away with 2 or possibly even 1. So I just skipped the lightest color. And for the little star that is on top of the unicorn, I just colored that in solid, being we already have that shading in the background with the C markers. Use my R21 to add a little bit of color to the cheeks of the stars and the unicorn. And now I'm taking out my Copic chart here to kind of fill in those little white areas that I have around my images where my masks weren't lined up. I just kind of move my panel around my color chart to determine which color best matches that portion of the background. And then I'll just use the very tip of the marker to fill in that small little area. You may have to go a little bit darker than what you would anticipate to make sure that this kind of is a seamless blend. Now here's where I forgot to press record again, but all I did was stamp the sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and then added some sparkle with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to just the stars. Adhered this to an A2 size top folding white note card with my Tombow Mono multi glue. And then I wanted to add some dimension here, being this is a 1-layer card. So I'm taking some glossy accents. And, oh, I forgot a little piece there. And I'm taking some glossy accents, and I'm just going to be adding these to the 3 larger stars. So I'm just taking this small bottle and I'm barely squeezing it. Once I get it going, I kind of stop squeezing it and just letting it flow out on its own. I outline the image and then I'll fill in the center, and I kind of let it fill in by itself. If there's any little areas, I can use the nozzle to kind of fill those in. Now this looks a little cloudy right now, but as it dries, it will dry completely clear. And after it dries, I did add some white gel pen details after it. Give it a couple of hours, but you can add some white gel pen details directly over the glossy accents. Next, I took some glitter drops or Nuvo drops and just added little itty bitty drops all over my background to give just a little bit more sparkle, as if there's more stars. But that is it. That's the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.